This is nuts. Literally 2 tablespoons of a sugar substitute that is literally still made from molecules of sugar just outperformed white sugar on every insulin marker that matters. It's not even close. There was one study in particular where researchers tested a food that is 70% sugar by dry weight. In this case, it was dates, and the glycemic index came in between 43 and 53. That's considered low to medium, and to give context, refined sugar sits at 65. Now, this video isn't just about date sugar. I just used that as an example. You can see that the same molecules, glucose, fructose, and sucrose, all have completely different outcomes. And the reason is because there's something that a lot of people have never heard of. Okay, there's a class of compounds in which the refining process was specifically designed to strip out. And once you understand what they do when they strip that out, you'll never look at sweeteners the same way because they're all wildly different. It's not just about sweetening something, or it's not just about carbohydrates. So here's what we're going to cover. First, we're going to talk about what refining is actually doing to sugar, because the sugar itself, I mean, we all kind of know in the back of our minds, like, this is coming from the earth. Is it really that bad? It's the refining and what it does to it. The compounds that it removes are the exact compounds that your body uses to slow absorption, but even to regulate insulin. Then we're going to talk about the specific mechanism that ties a lot of this together. There's a class of enzymes in your gut that convert carbs into absorbable sugar, and the compounds that are in unrefined sweeteners actively inhibit them. So it kind of protects us. And then we're going to talk about 4 sweetener categories that put this into practice. Date sugar, which is the only true whole food option. We're going to talk about coconut sugar, which actually brings a surprising prebiotic fiber angle. And then we're going to talk about the elephant in the room that's going to raise some eyebrows: the raw cane products, okay? So molasses, panela, okay, which a lot of people lump in with white sugar, but they actually shouldn't. They're different. And then we'll talk about how monk fruit ties into this, because it operates on a completely different mechanism altogether, even though some people still consider it a sugar. Okay, let's start with the refining here. Okay, whether you are starting with sugar cane, sugar beet, dates, coconut palm sap, industrial refining has a single goal. You isolate the sucrose or the glucose fraction, and you remove everything else, plain and simple. And what you end up with is pure carbohydrate. Okay, you've got no fiber, no minerals, no polyphenols. Those stripped out compounds are the exact thing that regulate how quickly that sugar gets absorbed. Okay, so the fiber slows the gastric emptying, and this adds viscosity, and that reduces how fast carb digesting enzymes can access that substrate. Okay, so this is not just about sugar is sugar, period. It's very different from molecule to molecule. But when you refine it, it becomes a lot simpler. It is just about the molecule. So polyphenols that are in the dates, in the coconuts, in the cane sugar, in the molasses, these inhibit those enzymes directly. So you have minerals like chromium, magnesium, zinc, potassium. These are all cofactors in insulin signaling. So refined white sugar is the sugar molecule, period, with its natural absorption brakes removed. That is why it hits the bloodstream fast, and that's why it demands a heck of a lot of insulin. I want to zoom in on one specific mechanism here because it carries across all the categories we talk about, and if you really take away one thing from this, it's going to be this: the enzymes alpha-glucosidase and alpha-amylase. These break carbohydrates down into absorbable sugar in your gut. If they're inhibited, even partially, carb absorption slows and the glucose curve flattens and insulin demand drops. There is a whole class of plant polyphenols that inhibits those enzymes. And this is actually how some pharmaceutical diabetes drugs even work. They block alpha-glucosidase to blunt the postprandial glucose. So the polyphenols in dates, in coconut sugar, in raw cane sugar, they are doing a milder version of the same thing through food. It's, again, we come back down to like, okay, if it comes from the earth, it's probably decent in some degree. It's only when it goes through either overconsumption, refinement, that it becomes problematic. So with that mechanism in mind, let's talk about dates, because date sugar is unique because it's not an extract. It's actually the whole fruit dried and ground. So you get all the fiber, all the polyphenols, all the minerals in date sugar. It's not like they're just sucking this syrup out of a date. So a medjool date is about 66 to 70% sugar by dry weight. All right, so it's mostly glucose and fructose. And on paper, that should spike blood sugar hard. And there was a study in the Nutrition Journal Okay, it tested 5 varieties of dates in 13 healthy people, okay, and also in people that had insulin resistance. And the GI came in around 46 to 55 in the healthy group, all which low to medium, and it was about 43 to 53 in insulin resistance. So with no statistically significant difference between the groups. What we saw is that the insulin resistance subjects' response to dates was as well controlled as the healthy volunteers. So even though refined sucrose sits at 65 for everybody. So basically, this date sugar worked in insulin-resistant people similarly to how it would work in a healthy person. That's not the same thing that would happen with refined sugar. Obviously, the insulin-resistant people would respond in a wildly different way. So what's doing the work is that 2 to 3% crude fiber in the date, plus the polyphenol load, plus all the inhibiting effect of like enzyme inhibitors that you're getting. So simply swapping date sugar for white sugar in a recipe, you're adding the same total carbohydrate, arguably a better taste, but all inside a matrix that modulates absorption more. This is the perfect example of why I'm excited about what this brand Lakanto just launched. Okay, I've talked about them before, and even if you take nothing away from this, you're learning how to use other sugars. Lakanto actually invented the monk fruit sweetener category in the first place. They used to use like the monk fruit that would coat over a molecule of erythritol, which was great for like low carb, keto. The whole world used it with low carb. They realized there's a lot of people out there that just want to bake. They want to use real sugar, but they don't want the glycemic effect or they don't want the insulin spike. So they have a new line where they actually have taken, get this, check this out. They have real date sugar, real coconut sugar, real cane sugar, and then they spray one like molecule or grain of that with monk fruit extract. So the monk fruit is doing the heavy lifting on the sweetness, so you can use about 70% less sugar to hit the same sweetness level, but still have the same taste as like date sugar, coconut sugar, or cane sugar. So you're getting 70% fewer calories from sugar, and it's because the base is still a real form of sugar, not a refined garbage sugar, but a date or a coconut or a cane, and it's not a sugar alcohol, and it's not an artificial sweetener. So you get like real authentic flavor with real browning, you get the real texture, but you're getting like it coated with monk fruit, so you don't need as much. So the date sugar version has the deep caramel note that you would get from whole dates. The coconut sugar gets that butterscotch flavor that you would normally get. And the cane sugar version is really clean and neutral for like baking a simple like white cake or something. So these perform like full sugar counterparts in cooking, but there's 0 artificial sweeteners. So you've got real sugar bases, but with monk fruit doing the sweetness work, so you use a lot less. Now I'll break down the full mechanism behind why monk fruit works, because it does work on an interesting angle. It's fascinating. There's these things called moghrosides, and there's anti-inflammatory data on them. There's like 5 RCTs on that. So I'm talking about that in a minute. But if you want to try this new Lakanto product, go to lakanto.com and you can get 15% off. Use code Thomas15 at checkout. Definitely just check these guys out. They're always innovating in this space. It's awesome. But let's talk coconut sugar, because again, even if you didn't use Lakanto, like even if you're not using this, I just think that's a cool product that I personally would think is awesome in anybody's kitchen. But I mean, heck, it's a big step if you swap your sugar for date sugar. But coconut sugar is technically an extract. It's not a whole food. Okay, so they take the coconut palm sap, they collect it, they heat it, and they evaporate it until it crystallizes. So you do lose the fiber structure. So at first you're like, is it still good? But what gets retained from the sap is cool, because there was a study in the International Journal of Environmental Research and Public Health. Okay, they looked at it, they saw that there was potassium, magnesium, iron, zinc, B vitamins B1 through B7, vitamin C, D, E, and K. Not to mention, literally in an evaporated sap, there were anthocyanins, there were flavonoids, there were polyphenols, and these are the same compound classes that inhibit alpha-glucosidase. It is not the same to take refined white sugar and compare it to coconut sugar. Wildly different. The GI of coconut sugar came in at around 35. Now, if you see it in the literature, you'll see it ranging from 35 to 54. But 35 GI from a sugar that quite frankly tastes better than regular sugar. But the finding I really want to flag here that was really interesting in the research was the inulin piece. There's 4.7 grams of inulin per 100 grams, and that's a very strong prebiotic fiber. So this is adding viscosity, it slows the digestion, but it also has a prebiotic effect when it ferments in our gut to a certain degree, creates more short-chain fatty acids. We have very direct data on what inulin does when it replaces sugar. If we look at the European Journal of Nutrition, there were 2 double-blind crossover studies. So in the first, 20% of the sucrose in a drink was replaced with oligofructose. In the second, 30% of sucrose in a fruit jelly was replaced with inulin. Both trials showed much reduced postprandial insulin and glucose response. So big effect there. But the reduction scaled linearly with how much sugar was replaced. So that 4.7 gram dose of like inulin that you get in coconut sugar is a measurable part of why it has such a low glycemic index. So you can use coconut sugar, tastes like sugar, but deeply embedded in that molecule are completely different compounds that change how it absorbs. And then when you get to raw cane sugar, it's very ambiguous because raw cane is the source material for refined white sugar. It's literally the same plant. So it's hard to make a case for this one until you start looking at some of the other raw cane products, right? You look at blackstrap molasses, you look at muscovado, rapadura, panela, all these, okay, they diverge from white sugar at the processing stage, but they retain the polyphenol fractions. Like I've done videos on molasses, how molasses has measurable impacts on insulin resistance. There was even a study in sugar tech. It extracted the polyphenols from sugarcane, molasses in this case, and it tested them directly against alpha-glucosidase and alpha-amylase. Basically what they found is that this extract showed clear inhibitory activity against both enzymes. However, that was an in vitro study, okay? So what we see in a lab isn't always identical to what you hit in the intestinal lumen if you were to eat molasses. But the biochemistry and mechanism is still pretty clear, and that's that the polyphenol fraction that we get from raw cane does something that white sugar cannot. So it's not the exact same. Okay? White sugar does not contain those compounds at all. So even though it's still coming from the sugar cane, we are talking about different things. Now, I wouldn't necessarily jump to go use pure raw sugar cane over, say, monk fruit or over honey or over dates. But for baking, it might make sense, especially if you're looking at it in the context of what I just mentioned with like Lakanto and stuff. You could still get that flavor that maybe we're just used to. Maybe it's not the best flavor, but maybe we're used to it. Like blackstrap molasses specifically is the most nutrient dense of a lot of these sugars we could talk about. It's one of the few non-animal sources of iron. Okay, so like we actually get a lot out of molasses, right? But let's talk about monk fruit because people would still consider monk fruit a sugar in some ways. However, it's a sugar that doesn't really act like sugar. Okay, so all those sugars that I talked about before contain the same sugar molecules as white sugar, but with like a full matrix. Monk fruit technically isn't a sugar. Okay, the sweetness comes from these compounds that are called molasses. Okay, and these are triterpenoid glycosides, which means your body actually doesn't recognize them as carbohydrates. So they don't get broken down by our salivary or intestinal enzymes at all. They don't stimulate insulin through the normal carb pathway. They pass through the small intestine almost entirely intact. So the glycemic index is effectively 0. But the more interesting thing about monk fruit is not about it being a sugar or not. Okay, there was a review in the journal Nutrients, and it showed looking at 5 randomized trials, so 5 RCTs, that across those trials, monk fruit extract reduced postprandial glucose by up to 18%, and insulin responses went down 12 to 22%. This was all compared to like a sugar sweetened control. So compared to sugar, like we actually saw insulin go down. In one of those trials, they even saw an anti-inflammatory effect. Inflammatory cytokines dropped about 25% compared to placebo. So there's an anti-inflammatory signal, and it points to these molasses having bioactive properties on top of providing sweetness without sugar. It's crazy. So the sugar molecules in dates, in coconuts, and raw cane are the same molecules that are in white sugar. Okay, refining is what strips out the fiber, the polyphenols, all that stuff. If you leave those in and the polyphenols in, that inhibits the enzymes that convert carbs into glucose, okay? So it ends up becoming way different. That's like the major piece here, is like, even though they're still sugars, they're still awesome in their natural way, right? Monk fruit, of course, takes a completely different route. It provides sweetness through the molasses. So it's technically not a sugar substitute, even though people call it that. So it's actually not a carbohydrate at all, but it still has measurable reductions in glucose, in insulin, and inflammation. So how do you use these? I would say date sugar would be your most straightforward whole food swap. Anywhere you would use sugar or a sweetener, you're gonna get the most, I think, out of date sugar. Higher polyphenols, right? Portion still applies, like you don't wanna use a ton of it, but it's a heck of a lot better than refined sugar. Again, you can use the Lakanto version, get the flavor, but still have the monk fruit effect. Coconut sugar, this would be good in recipes where you're looking for something to dissolve in liquid or batter. Inulin is really good at effectively distributing throughout a food matrix. So like if you're baking with it, it distributes well. So you get an even taste with coconut sugar. So for drinks, for sauces, marinades, like that's where it's really, really good. Now, for raw cane sugar, a little bit of molasses, a little bit of that with chocolate. Like, so however you choose to use that, right? Or just for straight up baking like a pure white cake or a sheet cake. Monk fruit is your option when you want genuine sweetness with no glycemic load at all, possibly even a drop. It's cleaner and rounder tasting than stevia. So it works a lot better in tea or coffee. Like a lot of times, if I don't want any calories, I'll use like a liquid monk fruit. I'll use a liquid monk fruit in tea, in coffee, in like cocoa, anything, right? Because I don't get any spike with it. Sometimes, literally my own anecdotal experience, I will actually drop glucose when I'm wearing a CGM. It's wild. A really powerful move, obviously, is combining them, right? You could use the date sugar, you can use the coconut sugar, and you combine that with monk fruit so you have the sweetness of the monk fruit, but the benefit and still the well-rounded taste. It's not just about sweetness. So anyone that's like a foodie knows that as much as you can make keto food with monk fruit or erythritol, it doesn't taste the same. Come on, guys. Like, I was close to 300 pounds before. I know what good food tastes like, right? And real good food, it does have sugar in it. I understand that. Doesn't mean I go out and eat it all the time, but yeah, you want that flavor. So these swaps are not a free pass to use a lot of sugar. Okay, they're still sugars, they're still calories. But again, I think Lakanto makes it pretty easy with that whole idea. So same molecules, but a much better outcome. Now, if you want to go deeper on one of the specific raw cane products I mentioned, I did a video recently on molasses. It kind of went viral because this stuff actually can stop insulin resistance in its tracks. And I break down how to use it. It's wild research. So I've linked to that video. You click on that thumbnail right here and you can check it out. And as always, I'll see you tomorrow.